This video was produced before Joe Biden announced his stepping down from the presidential race. In 2014, things looked optimistic in the United States. Barack Obama was president, a bill legalizing gay marriage was passed, a new Supreme Court justice would soon be appointed by a Democratic president, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just turned 80, capping off a legendary run in the United States Supreme Court, where she fought tooth and nail for women's rights and the end of racial and gender discrimination. And looking beyond the horizon, the United States would soon have its first woman president, Hillary Clinton.
Pokemon, go to the polls!
Shutting down the growing calls to retire from the Supreme Court after her second cancer diagnosis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was determined to retire under the first woman president in American history and have her predecessor be appointed by Hillary Clinton. "Who are you going to get who will be better than me?" she said. Hillary Clinton did not become president, meaning Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have to survive another 4 years to retire under a Democratic president. But she didn't. This decision to not step down when the time was right has led to far more destruction and dismantling of democracy than ever imagined. And now, in 2024, Joe Biden's refusal to step down when the time is right may also lead to far more destruction and dismantling of democracy than the Democratic Party wants to admit. Today's broadcast is brought to you by viewers like you. Become a member today and unlock exclusive content at patreon.com/NorthstarRadio. Prior to her death in 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was idolized and propped up almost as a godlike figure amongst the American left. Millennials specifically were really the leading force in this idolization, coining the now infamous nickname, the Notorious R.B.G.
Suddenly, Ginsburg went viral. Children's books to bumper stickers, Halloween costumes to a Hollywood biopic.
What did you say your name was?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Even her fitness trainer was a sensation.
Justice is blind, but you know man meat when you see it.
Selling t-shirts, hats, candles, all sorts of merchandise was sold to capitalize on this meme, to the point that this idolization sparked backlash, even from supporters of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. As the author of a biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Linda Hirschman, said, "She was very smart and very clever and very energetic. But she wasn't the only game in town." And at the time, even slight criticism of Ruth Bader Ginsburg was enough to be slandered online by supposed RBG cult members. But this amount of praise and worship was not without reason.
Ginsburg's opinions helped solidify the constitutional protections she'd fought so hard to establish decades earlier. And her grit helped keep her on the bench through colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, and the death of her beloved partner.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg made monumental achievements during her time in the Supreme Court, and even before her appointment as justice. In 1970, during her time as professor of law at Rutgers, she co-founded the first law journal in the United States to solely focus on women's rights. And 2 years later, she co-founded the Women's Rights Project with the American Civil Liberties Union, where in only 2 years spearheading the project, fought over 300 gender discrimination cases. And between 1973 and 1976, she argued and won 5 gender discrimination cases before the Supreme Court. She didn't only fight for women's rights, however, but rather she fought for gender equality.
She happened to have male clients because they were making claims that more traditionally were women's claims. And she wanted to just shake up the preconceived notions when it came to raising families and providing for them and working in the economy. Everybody should be on an equal footing.
As one of these 5 cases she argued in front of the Supreme Court was Weinberger versus Weisenfeld, in which Stephen Weisenfeld, after losing his wife during childbirth, wanted to raise his child right by spending more time at home and away from work. Yet after applying for Social Security, he was denied due to his gender.
One key case involved a man from New Jersey whose wife died during childbirth.
Stephen Weisenfeld's case concerns the entitlement...
He wanted to work less and stay home with his son, but found out only widows, not widowers, were eligible for Social Security payments.
So Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued that Social Security should not be determined by an archaic understanding of gender roles in a household, a case she easily won, with all 8 justices present voting in favor of Weisenfeld. In 1996, during her time in the Supreme Court, she was pivotal in the case of United States v. Virginia, making a once boys-only Virginia Military Institute now open for female enrollment, helping to further strengthen the American military-industrial complex. Man, no wonder liberals love this woman.
May it please the court. VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, was established by the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1839.
VMI was an age-old military academy run by the state of Virginia. It was men only.
State actors may not close entrance gates based on fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females.
So women will now be walking on the campus at the Virginia Military Institute.
I think she would say it was the case she was happiest about in her tenure on the court.
Throughout the years, she also fought to strengthen a woman's right to an abortion, and in her later years, she fought for the free expression of religion, while also keeping a strict separation of church and state. By the time Obama was into his second term as president, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had already been in the Supreme Court for 20 years.
Tonight on Eyewitness News at 6. Who is Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg? And what happened to Boston Appeals Court Judge Stephen Breyer on his way to the Supreme Court? And will the president's latest nominee face the problems some of his previous candidates have had?
And had made a name for herself as the leading progressive feminist voice in the United States government. And she wasn't planning on stepping down anytime soon.
We are honored to be joined by one of the justices of the Supreme Court. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is here. We are thrilled to see her.
Cornell has a long list of distinguished alumni, including politicians like Janet Reno and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said gutting the law that has helped end voter discrimination is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet.
Now, I'm not sure how intrinsic this is to such a story, but I feel as though it should be said. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not as progressive as people made her out to be. Heading into the Supreme Court as a seemingly radical, anti-establishment progressive, she quickly fell into place and became a sort of centrist in the court. At the time, she was pretty skeptical of Roe v. Wade and felt as though it came about too quickly.
But I had written a comment on Roe v. Wade, and it was not 100% applauding that decision.
And in the late 2010s, during the rise of Black Lives Matter, she was quick to question the movement and even described Colin Kaepernick's protest during the national anthem as dumb, arrogant, and stupid, going on record saying, "The protests show a contempt for a government that has made it possible for the protesters' parents and grandparents to live a decent life, which they probably could not have lived in the places they came from." So just put that information in the back of your head, because it explains a lot of things moving forward. Okay, it's 2014. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had this legendary run as a federal judge and then as a Supreme Court justice, and everyone loves her as this beloved 80-year-old meme representing women's rights and women's power in society and the progressive movements of 2010s America. But then people start talking about her age.
And now for a different question that justices face. When they're appointed to the Supreme Court, it is a job for life. But should it be? Some are posing that question now about the oldest sitting justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Supreme Court nomination is always fascinating for a president. President Obama had two relatively early on, Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor. Now it's been a while. Over the weekend, the retired Justice John Paul Stevens was out talking, and he said that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is 80 years old, she's had 2 bouts with cancer, he says that she has sought his advice about whether to stay, whether to go, if you're thinking about going, what to do. Listen to John Paul Stevens saying, of course, if you're thinking about leaving, you think about the politics.
This year, I wrote an op-ed in the LA Times urging Justice Ginsburg to step down at the end of the term, which was in this past July. I said that's the only way she could be sure that someone with her views and values would take her place on the court.
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't appreciate it.
Well, I asked Justice Ginsburg what her response was to the calls that she resigned, and she said she responded to academics who called for her resignation. Who better than I could get through the Senate right now? And I think her position is basically justices in the past have resigned either because of ill health, like Justices Marshall and Brennan, or because they literally wanted to go hiking, like Justices Souter and O'Connor, who Justice Ginsburg talked about. And she feels, and the interview confirmed, that she's at the height of her power. She's writing opinions faster than anyone else. She has become a fiery voice and leader for the liberal opposition, and she feels that given that fact, there's no need for her to resign.
I think I should do this job as long as I can do it full steam. And when I begin to slow down, I think I will know. It hasn't happened yet.
For the most part, mainstream liberal media was calling for her resignation, a not so common occurrence for a liberal in government. Barack Obama even, in 2013, took her out to lunch one day and suggested she retire as soon as possible for the good of the country. But these calls coming from inside the House were not enough for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she refused to step down, with her reasoning being, who do you think President Obama could appoint at this very day? Given the boundaries that we have, the Senate will block it.
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg says she isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The justice reportedly said yesterday she hopes to stay on the bench for at least another 5 years. Ginsburg made the comments after a play about the late Justice Antonin Scalia. She told journalists she's 85 and that Justice John Paul Stevens was 90 when he retired, so she thinks she has at least that long.
Now, R.B.G. said this in September 2014, only a month before an election that could swing the Senate to a Republican majority. And that's exactly what happened, making it so that a progressive appointment to the Supreme Court would be blocked by the Senate, guaranteed.
Just hours ago, U.S. House Speaker John Boehner was narrowly re-elected to his third term in the post as Republicans took full control of both chambers of Congress, a first in 8 years.
So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg stuck around. She stayed in the Supreme Court, not only to avoid the Senate blocking her replacement, but also to allow for her replacement to be appointed by the first woman president of the United States, saying in 2016, it's likely that the next president, whoever she will be, will have a few appointments to make. Well, funny thing actually. That didn't happen. The Democratic Party, with growing fears of a popular socialist movement, rejected a far more popular candidate and opted to nominate Hillary Clinton. Someone so unlikable, they lost to Donald Trump in what was supposed to be a landslide victory.
Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
It's pretty clear you won't admit that the Russian.
You deal in probabilities. So what are the odds you're putting on the race right now?
So right now we have Hillary's about a 75 or an 80% favorite. We have different versions of the forecast you can look at. She's ahead in almost every poll, every swing state, every national poll.
Hillary Clinton. I will be voting for Hillary Clinton.
How untrusted they both were. What it looks like has developed is that voters would rather go with a flawed outsider than a flawed insider.
CNN can report that Hillary Clinton has called Donald Trump to concede the race.
Here at City Diner, election night excitement turned to disbelief and cries of defeat. Clinton supporter Nabila Nanji was stunned.
It's just quite frankly frightening. He is not a reflection of the country that I was raised in.
Democrat Greg Traynor said he wanted a primary do-over.
None of this would have happened with Bernie Sanders.
So there she was, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sitting on the Supreme Court under a Trump presidency. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would not go on to make it another 4 years and somehow resign under Biden's presidency. Rather, she once again fell ill and succumbed to her illness. And the justice that would be replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg? None other than Amy Coney Barrett.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you, President Trump, for selecting me to serve as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Amy Coney Barrett was pivotal in the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, something Ruth Bader Ginsburg predicted could happen ever since the case's original ruling. How could this happen? How could a progressive democratic government allow for such an oversight? Even the media, the propaganda tool that is, for the most part, meant to prop up the American government and their goals, both domestic and international, was calling for her resignation. One of the leading progressive feminist icons in America was being told to step down from her position in the government, not just because the time had arrived, but more as a strategic reason that even the President of the United States was pushing for. But Ruth, she didn't want to leave. She thought she was best fit for the job and that it'd be too risky to leave at that time. She thought she was best fit for the job. One decision to not resign when the time was right allowed for her entire legacy of women's empowerment and gender equality to be thrown out of the window. Now that her final act as Supreme Court Justice, the final event she will be known for, is allowing for a fascist, woman-hating justice to take her place. Within 1 decade, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy went from she didn't get to the Supreme Court by letting other people tell her what she could do to in 2022 becoming extraordinarily self-centered. As according to Politico, the common consensus opinion amongst former clerks and inner circle members was that it was an extraordinarily self-centered thing to do. Does that remind you of anyone? Someone who's currently holding office? Well, their body's there. I'm not sure if they're all there, if you know what I mean. This situation reminds me a lot of the current 2024 presidential race by Joseph Robinette Biden, an establishment Democrat who spent so much time in the American government that calls for them to resign are met with a delusional self-confidence, where in spite, they refuse to leave their position, ultimately harming everyone besides themselves.
Is President Biden considering stepping down?
Absolutely not.
In 2021, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in the presidential election. And not as easily as you'd expect, but he won nonetheless, mostly because people just wanted to see Trump out of office. This led to a fairly high approval rating right out of the gate, at a solid 55.3%. But as the presidency went forward, the Biden administration's approval rating quickly plummeted, as many promises made by the Democratic Party were not upheld, especially in June of 2022, dropping to a brutal 37.9% approval rating after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, something that Biden said in 2019 he would work to enshrine into law.
Considering the new Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, what are your particular plans to protect women's reproductive rights in the U.S.?
Number one, we don't know exactly what she will do, although the expectation is that she may very well move to overrule Roe. But the only responsible response to that would be to pass legislation making Roe the law of the land. That's what I would do.
Biden's approval rating has stayed under 50% ever since, and has steadily decreased over time. And when the midterms came around, the same people who voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election came out in droves to make their voices heard and tell to the Democratic Party, Joe Biden has been a major disappointment. I will be voting uncommitted in hopes that it convinces you to nominate anyone but Joe Biden.
I'm very, very unhappy with Biden on how he's conducted the war in Gaza.
If you hadn't seen that uncommitted movement, who would you be voting for otherwise?
Probably would have stayed home.
10% of Democratic voters in Michigan, 15% in Minnesota voted uncommitted. And that's a ton considering many people just stayed home, deeming this midterm as pretty unnecessary, which it was. But once again, the Democratic Party did not listen, and in many states, skipped the midterm elections altogether and nominated Joe Biden automatically.
In case you forgot, this week, the executive committee of the Florida Democratic Democracy told voters that they would not be allowed to vote against Biden. And that's not the only state, baby. They also did it in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Massachusetts. Don't you just love democracy?
But now, it's the summer leading up to a presidential election. The election season is in full swing.
Well, we've seen a lot of speeches covering these political conventions, none quite like that one.
But Biden is still not convincing his original voter base, so the Democratic Party needed to do something about it. In an effort to reassure the country and the Democratic Party and its supporters, the Biden administration decided to bump up the presidential debate to an earlier time, not only to reassure the country as early as possible, but also to give Biden as good a chance as he needs to win in a debate against Trump. Because if it wasn't already clear, 2024 Joe Biden is significantly weaker than 2020 Joe Biden. And I mean significantly. So as you can imagine, this debate went probably as poorly as it ever could, likely going down in history as the worst performance in a presidential debate, finally proving to the American people that all their worries were correct, and Joe Biden is absolutely not fit to be president. But it could have been worse. At least Biden didn't trip and fall.
I continue to think we have to make fundamental changes in civil rights, and those civil rights, by the way, include not just only African Americans, but the LGBT community.
He wants to get rid of the ability of Medicare
Similarly to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after this awful performance on a debate stage, Democrats and Republicans and even supporters of Biden came out in droves to call for Biden's resignation from the presidential race.
I too was on the phone throughout much of the debate with Democrats, with people who are political operatives, with campaign operatives. My phone really never stopped buzzing. The universal reaction was somewhere approaching panic.
I think it's critical that we ask the same questions about this man I love, respect. I think we have to ask the same questions of him that we have asked of Donald Trump, and that is, if he were CEO and he turned in a performance like that, would any corporation in America, any Fortune 500 corporation in America, keep him on as CEO?
The job of the president is making decisions. The job of a presidential candidate is to communicate. It just is. That's the job. It's a communications job. It is talking to people and communicating them, persuading them, trying to get people who don't agree with you. And I think Joe Biden has a very good record on making decisions, and I think he's a very poor communicator right now.
And similarly to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Joe wasn't having any of it. He continued to insist he was not going anywhere.
President Biden's campaign is publicly insisting he's not going anywhere, but the calls for him to step aside seem to be growing. Sources are telling CNN that former Speaker Nancy Pelosi actually played a role in Congresswoman Lofgren's call for Biden to step aside. Another source described the president as being, quote, seething at Nancy Pelosi right now.
I had a little debate last week. Can't say it was my best performance. We love it, Joe. But ever since then, there's been a lot of speculation. What's Joe going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? What's he going to do? Well, here's my answer. I am running and going to win again. I'm staying in the race. I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020. Well, by the way, we're going to do it again in 2024. I learned long ago, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
But as these calls for resignation grew wider and louder in the media, the Biden administration once again had to do something about it. And as a last-ditch effort, scheduled a one-on-one, unedited conversation with George Stephanopoulos on ABC. And what Joe Biden had to say strongly echoed what Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to say a decade earlier, when she too found her age under question. The first significant moment in this interview is when Biden states that he believes he's the person most qualified to do the job of president, even at the ripe old age of 81.
Is it worth the risk? I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me.
You know, the heart of your case against Donald Trump is that he's only out for himself, putting his personal interest ahead of the national interest. How do you respond to critics who say that by staying in the race, you're doing the same thing?
Oh, come on. Well, I don't think those critics know what they're talking about.
I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because the media has turned against him seemingly overnight, but Joe Biden is acting and sounding more and more like Donald Trump every day. Because in this interview, not only does he appear incredibly orange, as well as mention the fact that he's able to draw large crowds at rallies, which actually suggests he's still popular.
You've said, going back to 2020, watch me. to people who are concerned about your age. And 50 million Americans watched that debate. It seemed to confirm fears they already had.
Well, look, after that debate, I did 10 major events in a row, including until 2 o'clock in the morning after that debate. Did events like this today, large crowds, overwhelming response, no slipping.
But he also outright denied what a handful of voting polls have come out and shown post-debate. He's literally doing Trump shit.
Do you really believe you're not behind right now?
I think all the pollsters I talk to tell me it's a toss-up.
New York Times and NBC both have you about 6 points behind in the popular vote.
That's exactly right. New York Times had me behind before anything happened to do with this race.
Just when you look at the reality, though, Mr. President, I mean, you won the popular vote in 2020, but it was still deadly close in the Electoral
By
College.
7 million votes.
Yes, but you're behind now in the popular vote.
I don't buy that.
Joe Biden is very stuck in his ways and won't step down from the race even if Jill Biden tells him to. He will only exit this race if the Lord Almighty comes down and tells him to.
If you can be convinced that you cannot defeat Donald Trump, will you stand down?
It depends if the Lord Almighty comes down and tells me that, I might do that.
It's certainly not on the same scale, but this is unfortunately giving God told me to invade Iraq vibes.
At a meeting with Palestinian leaders in June 2003, then President Bush reportedly having claimed that God told him to go to war. Mr. Bush reported as having said, quote, "God would tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan, and I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end the tyranny in Iraq, and I did." He
wouldn't even answer the simple question, would you step down if you were convinced you couldn't win?
And if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi come down and say, we're worried that if you stay in the race, we're going to lose the House and the Senate, how will you respond?
I go into detail with them. I've spoken to all of them in detail. They all said I should stay in the race. None of the people said I should leave.
But if they do?
Well, it's like, they're not going to do that.
You sure?
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
The worst part of it all came at the very end of the interview, when George Stephanopoulos asked a very, very simple question. What if Trump does win this election and all your worries come to fruition? How will you feel in January? And with everything at stake, liberal democracy, freedom of speech, religion, as many freedoms of abortion that we still have, with all that at stake in this incredibly important election, with Project 2025 just around the incredibly dark corner, this is how Joe Biden responded.
And if you stay in and Trump is elected and everything you're warning about comes to pass, how will you feel in January?
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
Did I hear that correctly? I'll feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
Did we not just have a 30-minute conversation discussing the importance of this election and the possible implications of Biden not being strong enough to beat Trump, quite possibly leading to a slow yet rapid downfall of this country and the democratic process for decades to come? Was that not literally why we're having this conversation in the first place? This presidential campaign and fighting off what could potentially be the end of the United States as we know it is not about giving it the old college try. It's not about giving it your all, trying your best. It's about saving the last semblance of democracy that we have left. And there's not much.
To disperse, you will be placed under arrest and charged with disorderly conduct. This is the New York City Police Department. You are unlawfully obstructing pedestrian traffic.
Now, I know boomers despise a participation trophy, but here's the thing. Joe Biden is so old, he's from before the boomers. So the silent generation must love participation trophies.
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. Did the goodest job as I know I can do. Did the goodest job, did the goodest job.
Okay, the Democratic Party has been really, and I mean really, convincingly leaning into replacing Joe Biden as the nominee. But now, today, as I write this on July 9th, things don't seem so certain anymore. and Joe Biden could very well be on the ticket come fall. But is there still time? 4 months is a very long time. We can't possibly not be able to do anything about it. Well, looking back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2014, after receiving a plethora of calls to resign, including from Barack Obama, her excuse, her main reason for not resigning at that moment, was that an election was coming up. An election that would flip the Senate to Republican, ultimately blocking any appointee too progressive for their liking. But she said that in September 2014, months before the election would take place. And she even used the same excuse in 2015, after the Senate had flipped Republican, almost making it seem like she didn't have an opportunity to resign safely before. But she did. In April of 2014, a panel on CNN was discussing whether or not R.B.G. should step down, arguing it should be sooner rather than later because they had a Democratic majority at the time.
I think they probably expect to have at least one more seat to fill over the next 2.5 years. So there will be a list, and I think we will all look forward to covering it.
You say over the next 2.5 years, but Alex, there's a real possibility the Republicans take the Senate in November. So if you're President Obama and you're thinking, I may get one, maybe two, but let's think about one more pick. Do you want it to happen now, in the short term, when you know Harry Reid's the majority leader? Or do you assume you're going to have to deal with this after the election and who knows?
Yes. At the time, Barack Obama had a supermajority. Only 2 years after her second cancer diagnosis in 2009, Barack Obama had a supermajority. She couldn't have been given a more clear sign to resign at that very moment. But for whatever reason, selfishness perhaps, maybe out of spite due to the plethora of calls to step down from her peers, Ruth Bader Ginsburg remained in the Supreme Court far beyond when it was safe to resign. There was time, but the powers at hand waited far too long. Now, is there time for Biden to resign? Yes. The Democratic Party has a history of selfishness, self-centered legacy individuals who are too far gone to realize we'd now be better without them. We can look back at these moments with embarrassment and with shame, but we must also learn from them. Moments that may seem lacking in significance can turn into momentous situations, causing harm to this country and its people for decades to come. People with enormous legacies far beyond what they can carry, possibly questionable legacies, but legacies nonetheless, can be tarnished in an instant, simply by overstaying your welcome. The Democratic Party needs to make drastic changes, both in their operations, but also in their branding. Young people don't want to associate themselves with a party that doesn't listen to them, completely ignoring their calls for candidates much more popular than the brand standard the party has been touting around for nearly a century at this point. I don't know if Joe Biden will step down, but in doing so, he could save this country and ultimately save his legacy. But unfortunately, if the Democratic Party makes the wrong decision, Donald Trump will be our next president. And given the track record of the Democratic Party, I expect the wrong decision to be made. Thank you for watching North Star Radio. Peace and love. Free Palestine.